Okay, everybody, it's 1 minute after 9, so I think we will start. Dan McLean, I just would like you, yes, you can hear me, good. He's my test subject. My boss is my test subject, everybody. Okay, so I'm just gonna talk really briefly here, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Eric Nickel, who is the Director of Operations for the PTRC. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. It is the Petroleum Technology Research Centre's Aquistore project update webinar. First of all, attendees have been muted. We would like you, if you have questions as the presentations progress, to type them into the Q&A that's at the bottom of your screen as opposed to using chat. You can type things into chat. I have my colleague in communications, Matea Kalamsi, checking the chat. But we also have Zainab Movahedzadeh, who is our engineer out at the Aquistore site, who is also on this call today, who is going to be checking the Q&A and arranging the questions for the end of the seminar for the last 10-15 minutes so the questions can be asked. We do plan to end at 10 o'clock, but if questions are going well, we will certainly allow people to stay in and ask questions and continue on past the 10 o'clock deadline. Those of you who have to move on, that's fine. We will say goodbye to you at that point. I think with that in mind, just one thing about the Aquistore project, because I'm going to let Eric introduce all of the speakers and to do his introductions about what is Aquistore and how it started. But annually, we usually have an annual general meeting for Aquistore that's held in different cities. We've held it in Ottawa, we've held it in Regina, we've held it actually in Banff last year, which was a nice change. We're obviously not able to do that this year, which is why we decided, one of the reasons we decided to hold this webinar was to share information about the project on a broader level, not just to participants in the program, whether they're researchers or sponsors. So with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation program to Eric Nickel, our Director of Operations, who will introduce you to the project and to the speakers. Eric.
Thanks very much, Norm. Would like to start by saying I hope everyone, this presentation finds everyone safe and well at home, protecting themselves from strange world events that are going on right now. This is the first time we've done this kind of webinar, so please bear with us if there's any technical difficulties. I'd like to mention, as Norm already did, that the President and CEO of the PTRC, Dan McLean, is on the line as well. And I'd also like to acknowledge the PTRC board members, Cecile Seeley, Andy Melnick, Tyler Ellis-Toddington, and Craig Murray, also on the line today. So that's nice to see their participation as well. So without further ado, I'll just get going here. Next slide. So what is Aquistore? Why are you listening to a guy from Saskatchewan right now in whatever country you're in? What makes Saskatchewan such a good place to do carbon capture and storage? And then we're going to pass it off to our expert SERC members, the Science and Engineering Research Committee, and some of our lead researchers on the Aquistore program. So we're going to have Dr. Ben Rostron from the University of Alberta talking about the geologic setting and also the surface monitoring systems. We're going to have Dr. Don White from the Geologic Survey of Canada talk about the work that he's done in imaging the plume. Dr. Chris Hawkes from the University of Saskatchewan will talk about induced seismicity investigations and time-lapse logging. And then we'll end it off with Dr. Rick Chalaturnik, also from the University of Alberta, to talk about some of the interesting pressure monitoring systems and results that we have and how that is affecting not only research around the project, but operations day to day as well. I'll come on the line a little bit at the end as well to summarize everything. So why are you listening to a guy from Saskatchewan? I often show this map. It's outlined there in red in Canada, for those of you not familiar with the Canadian provinces. This is a massive area, and a lot of it is showing a very good, or at least good, basin suitability for CCS in the region. We have thousands and thousands of kilometers of specifically the Deadwood Formation that is suitable for CCS injection. And it's all onshore and all very accessible with decent infrastructure in the areas for the most part. We also have a lot of those pink dots, and those pink dots are sources. Saskatchewan in particular is still quite reliant on coal and natural gas power for one thing. CCS makes a lot of sense here. And also we have other things like cement plants and refineries in the region that also can be mitigated. Their carbon emissions can be mitigated via CCS. So a little bit of background before we get going here. Related to this is the Boundary Dam power plant. It's a coal-fired power plant, and the decision was made, in sort of 2010 timeframe to put carbon capture on one of the units. I believe it's this smokestack here. Unit 3 feeds its waste stream through this to what this part is here, which is the carbon capture center. It strips out the sulfur and the CO2 in these buildings here, and then goes to this building for compression. And if you could zoom in here, which we can't, but there's about a 14-inch pipeline coming out of at the end of this of compressed pure CO2. That goes off to either Aquistore, to our wells, or to the Weyburn Oil and Gas Field for EOR operations. In 2011, we made the decision and had the funding, thankfully, to drill 2 wells, an injection well and an observation well. You'll hear the researchers today talk about the injector and the obs well. That's what they are. We drilled those in the summer of 2012 with a lot of core analysis and work done on them, instrumentation, which we will go over as well. The plant, however, was not completed for another 3 more years, and we didn't receive any CO2 until April of 2015. But that said, commissioning the well and all of that, there were a lot of lessons learned. I would say generally in operations, there were a lot of difficult lessons learned and perhaps some things that we know that can help you in your projects down the road. Here's just some schematics of the 2 wells. On the left is the injector. It is cased right to 3396 meters. At the time, the deepest well in the province. There's a tubing string in there and a packer set at the top of the Deadwood zone to allow for injection. We have casing and tubing conveyed fiber optic systems that measure pressure and temperature. And so that's a heavily monitored injection well. 150 meters to the north is the OBS well, the observation well, much more simply completed. It is not exposed to the reservoir, save for a casing conveyed fluid sampling port. So there's a small, I believe it's 1/4-inch tube leading down to a fluid sampling port that has a rather ingenious mechanism to allow for it to sample fluids. And as Dr. Chalaturnik will tell us later, it's been repurposed now since the Plume has moved well beyond this observation well. Again, there is casing conveyed fiber optic lines on that we use for temperature and pressure, but most importantly, DAS, or distributed acoustic sensing, as well. This is the area that we're talking about. So this is the plant, as I was showing you, the 5 smokestacks. There's a pipeline that heads off to the northwest to the Weyburn area, but a spur of that pipeline comes back and feeds into the injection well here. We have a 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer area of investigation that is important for us to monitor the soil gas and the seismicity and the groundwater in. And we do that in part using, just bring that up, 630 geophones in a grid. These are permanently emplaced in the ground with a recorder and battery that gets changed periodically to allow for continued operation. There's a certain number that are kept alive all of the time to measure passive seismic, but then when there is a seismic shoot going on, or seismic survey, all of these 630 are turned on and listening for the seismic activity. The green things, they're a little bit hard to see. That is our soil gas sampling stations. We measure not only the absolute soil gas during 4 different seasons in the ground, but also the soil gas flux to ensure that that CO2 is not leaking up through the ground. It's complicated a little by the fact that we are on reworked coal mine tailings, so there is a little bit of natural methane in the ground from that. But the signatures, we are able to separate those out. And finally, the blue dots represent our monitoring superstations that have things like INSAR reflectors, tilt meters. I believe the piezometer wells are attached to these, and then of course there's solar panels and things like that to keep it all running. And we have a young fellow whose job it is out there to keep all of this stuff working, so that we can continue to monitor CO2 injection as it's occurring out there. With that, I will move it on to the next speaker that Norm will introduce. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you at the end of the hour.
Thanks very much, Eric. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yep, this is Ben Rostrom, by the way.
Okay, so I'll share my screen here and get this all going. Okay, so, well, thanks everyone for attending this. And I guess I'm first up. I'm going to talk about the geological work that was done. And so essentially, to go back to talk about a CO2 project, we did an extensive amount of characterization. I could talk about this for probably 8 hours, and I'm going to try and chop this down to 9 minutes, something like that. Essentially, the geological and hydrogeological and geophysical characterization for the project was undertaken really in 4 steps. I'm going to break it up into pre-drill things we did, talk about some of the things we did during drilling, and then basically talk about post-drilling, and then some of the things that we're doing right now with integration. And obviously, I can't go through all the details, so I've picked a couple things just to highlight in my slides. But the first part, so before we drilled the wells, we went through an extensive process of characterization using existing data. And then that was used to guide a risk assessment. And from the risk assessment and the initial characterization work, we used that to design the monitoring network. And from all that, we went into permitting. So all the geoscience was used in permitting. And then we undertook an extensive public communication process where we actually communicated the geology and the results of the characterization work to the actual nearby landowners and the public. And then from that, we went into a drilling phase, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But that we did extensive work while we were drilling in both the injection well, the observation well, and then testing of those 2 installations. Once we had finished that, we continued doing characterization work, usually as part of the background or the baseline characterization for the monitoring elements. And you heard Eric talk about some of the things we're doing in the monitoring program, and I'll highlight a couple of those in particular. I work on the hydrogeology, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, you know, the geoscience part of that hasn't gone away because we've looped back around now, and I'll just very briefly talk at the end about the fact that the geology is always behind all of these conformance, all the reservoir simulation work that we're doing. And what we're finding now is that, you know, as we have more and more data to calibrate to, we have to go back and revisit the geological information that we used. So first of all, Eric mentioned that we're in the middle of the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin. There's an extensive existing literature base and well base in the area. So the initial work that we did used basically the existing geological characterizations that were published by things like the Geological Survey, where we had structure maps, isopac maps. We were able to construct regional cross sections. There was 11 wells in the area. It's a large area of southeast Saskatchewan. But there was 11 wells. We were able to make some cross sections. We had pretty decent idea of the subsurface temperature field, the subsurface pressure field, and the water chemistry field. And we also had things like potash mines in the area that had decent amounts of data, and a wide access of cores to actually look at some of the cores from these drilled wells in the area. The other thing that's available, because this is an oil and gas region, there's industry seismic that was available. And so the very, very first thing we did was had a consulting company, Carbon Services at Schlumberger, built sort of a medium scale model and did some predictions of what would various scenarios look like for a plume size distributions. And so we said, okay, well, you know, we want to do 2,000 tons a day and inject 1.5 million tons of CO2, and how big would the plume be? So we had some idea, you know, these are kilometer scale plumes, 4 or 5 kilometers wide after 10 years of injection. And that was used to guide the risk assessment and the monitoring program. And Eric mentioned this size of an area that we monitored around was based on these very, very preliminary calculations with layer cake models, homogeneous stratigraphy, and things like that. Now, we were also able to purchase two-dimensional seismic lines. So once we had our site location and our sort of focus area, we purchased the existing trade data, had it reprocessed into a pseudo three-dimensional view that basically gave us some idea of the reservoir level. What were our reservoir going to look like? What was the seals going to look like? And we were particularly concerned about, we're right above the Precambrian basement, and it's known to have these pop-up features where the reservoir level, the Deadwood level, could be eroded down to 0 thickness. So we were quite concerned about that. And so we were able to get, this is a reprocessed structure map of the Precambrian surface, and you'll see it's highly irregular here. And you'll see also some of these features that have some orientations to them. And so these are going to see later on that these orientations in the Precambrian that are there, you know, there's very angular features in these things, and we have lots of debates over whether these are faults, whether these are flexures, or what's the implication going to be for migration. But the data showed us that at the reservoir level, there was no offset faults, and the seals were continuous and thick over top of the reservoir. So that gave us confidence to move forward with the project. And then so once we had done the reprocessed data, we shot our own 3D seismic, and Don might talk a little bit about this. So in 2012, shot a 3D seismic over our project area, the wells in the center here. And this is an isopac of one of the major sealing units above the reservoir, far above the reservoir, the prairie evaporite. And you can see that on average, it's 150 meters thick, plus or minus a few places where there's been some weird anomalies. We can discuss those in the question period if you'd like. But we've got extensive regional seals that make this a pretty good spot to do some drilling. So based on that, we went ahead and drilled the wells. At the wells itself, I'll just highlight the fact we collected 48 meters of full diameter core, including the caprock and the caprock transition to the top of the reservoir, as well as a core deeper in the reservoir, and also 30 sidewall cores throughout the reservoir levels to look at various rock properties. Of course, extensive well logging. In fact, the Schlumberger reps said this was the largest core logging program they had done in Western Canada that year. Basically, every tool that Schlumberger had, we ran in the borehole. It took 5 days or so to do that. And so you can just read the list there, but all the standard well logs plus a few fancy ones. I'll point out that we did some modular dynamic testing, downhole testing, to do formation pressure measurements. We collected some fluid samples, and we did a mini frac test. And then once the holes were cased, we also did some cased hole logging, cement imaging, neutron, pulse neutron RST tests. And Chris is going to talk more about that because we've continued that. So from that, we were able to build a very detailed geological model of not only the reservoir level, but the horizons above it. And this cartoon we've used many times in our public meetings. You can see for scale up here, here's the power plant at the surface up here to scale. And we're injecting at 3,400 meters down in the Deadwood. And on the right-hand side is just an illustration of the porous zones that are targeted, for instance, by oil and gas companies working in the area, and the Midale and the Bakken and the Red River. And we're injecting below that, those oil and gas horizons. But more importantly, from a public perspective and from a migration perspective, is the laterally extensive, thick seal layer shown on the right-hand side of this diagram. So we have, 600 to 800 meters of Colorado Cretaceous group shales. We have the Watrous, which is the cap rock for the, billion-barrel oil fields in the area, the Midale, Mississippian age reservoirs. We have the prairie evaporite, so 150 meters plus or minus of halite sitting here. And then above the reservoir, we have the Winnipeg Shale, which is our primary seal zone. Now, once we get into post-drilling, the characterization work that was done was part of the baseline for the MMV program. And you'll see that Eric mentioned this, so I won't talk about this. I'll just very briefly mention these super sites in the groundwater system. And what's novel about our groundwater system is that we included the local landowners in the monitoring network. So these red dots here are actually drinking wells from the landowners in the area. And then we put our data points in a cross and made use of some existing data points that are there. The story with the groundwater is pretty boring. It's rural Saskatchewan, the relatively poor groundwater in the area, and we've monitored, this is 6 years of monitoring, and there's basically no change in the results at all. Now, final slide, going forward with this. So we've got a lot of integration work to go on. You can imagine we've got well logs, we've got measured data, drill sem test type data, generations of simulation data, and all these things have to match each other. And so we're in a phase right now where we're going back and looking at comparing measured data to scale data and trying to make this all fit with the rest of the sets. So with that, I'll pass it on to Don to talk about the geophysics.
Okay, Don White, by the way, is with the Geological Survey of Canada. Don.
All right, I'm just waiting for Ben to give up the screen.
Oh, right, I could do that.
There you go.
Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. It's Don White here. I'm broadcasting from sunny Ottawa, the capital of Canada. So what I'm going to talk today about is the seismic program within Aquistore, and in particular our efforts to provide time-lapse imaging of the CO2 plume as it evolves over time. So here's an outline. The three things I'll try and touch on: 4D seismic monitoring. We've also been monitoring for induced seismicity. And at the very end, if I have time, I'll quickly mention some of the different monitoring methods we've been testing. So in coming to the Aquistore site, there are some challenges and advantages as listed on the left-hand side of your screen. On the right is a perspective plot, and you can see that the Aquistore reservoir is down around 3,400 meters depth. We have a thick evaporite layer overlying that. That's the regional seal. And in comparison, you can see the depth of Weyburn on that plot. So having worked in Weyburn, we gained a lot of experience there. We had 8 years of operational experience, and we've taken those lessons and brought them to Aquistore. So the two primary challenges in monitoring using seismic methods at Aquistore are that the reservoir is deep and the injection rate is relatively low. So what we've done in terms of feasibility is determining whether, given the layout that we're using at the Aquistore program with this permanent array and going back and doing repeat surveys, can we actually image the plume? So we've done modeling to test that, where we've simulated a baseline and a follow-up monitor survey after 200,000 tons of injection, run that through the processing sequence to see if in fact we can image the plume. So those results are shown here on the right-hand side. You can see the model that was used of CO2 saturation, and on the left, you can see the time-lapse seismic results. So the basic feasibility result is that we think we can depict the CO2 plume as it evolves if we do things correctly. So in terms of CO2 injection, Ben talked about simulations where we're looking at up to 1 million tons per year of injection. But in fact, most of the CO2 has been used for enhanced oil recovery. So we've received a smaller amount of CO2, and the injection over time is shown here. And you can see the injection rates have been variable, and at times they've been low, and other times they've been much higher. We've gone back, we did a baseline survey in May of 2013, and we've been back 4 times to do repeat surveys when cumulative volumes of CO or masses of CO2 that were injected were 36, 102, 141, and most recently 272 kilotons. So today I'm going to show you for the first time in public results from that most recent survey that was conducted in January. So here is a slice through the 3D time-lapse cube at the reservoir level. We're looking at a depth interval of about 500 meters here. The reservoir interval is labeled there, so you can see it. It's roughly 250 meters thick. And you can see the images for the 4 different monitor surveys that have been done. So starting at the upper left, to be frank, at 36 kilotons, we weren't certain whether we would see anything in the time-lapse image. But as you can see, there is a bright spot at the injection well. And lower down, there's another fainter one, which we didn't pay much attention to at the time. By the time of the second monitor survey, that upper plume continues to grow in width. It's probably on the order of 250 meters wide, and the lower anomaly continues to grow. By the time of the third survey, the upper anomaly continues to grow. It's probably 400 meters wide at this stage. And I'll just note that at the time of this survey, the background noise levels were much higher. So you can see there's a lot more random noise in the background. So this technique is subject to the conditions at the time of recording. So you have to keep track of that. And finally, these are the first results from the survey that was conducted in January. And for the first time, we have really good evidence that CO2 is forming in the uppermost part of the reservoir. And again, the lower part of the plume continues to grow in width. If we move over to the east a little bit and take a slice through the observation well, these are the same 4 panels shown again. And again, you can see the main plume developing over time. And by the time we get to the 4th survey, you can see evidence for CO2 in the upper part of the reservoir. You can also see that the anomaly is much brighter as we move over towards the observation well. And one thing I didn't mention in the previous slide is that if you look at these, you'll note that with the exception of the last survey, the CO2 is moving primarily to the north, which is in the up-dip direction. We can also compare the time-lapse seismic with results from the observation well, where we've done monitoring for CO2. And there's a pretty good correlation of where we see the plume developing seismically with where we see it in the well logs. So let's look at those same results in plan view this time. And again, we'll go through the 4 monitor surveys. I've included a circle that's 500 meters in diameter for scale, the injection well and the observation well. So you can see from survey 1 to 2, the change in size of the plume, but you'll also notice there seems to be some sort of boundary just to the southwest of the injection well that is controlling where the CO2 is going. Moving on to later times at monitor 3 on the left-hand side, things are still moving mostly to the north. But by the last survey, the one in January, you can start to see the plume spreading to the south-southeast for the first time. And again, we see this fairly hard cutoff to the southwest. In this slide, we're looking in the background colors. We're looking at topography on the Precambrian surface after we've removed the regional dip. The hot colors represent topographic highs, the blue topographic lows. And you can see the structural trends in the basement are north-northwest, south-southeast. And this seems to be having a significant effect on controlling where the CO2 is spreading. So let's move on to induced seismicity. Of course, this is a concern in any injection project. We've been monitoring for 7 years. We monitored for at least 2 years prior to the start of CO2 injection and continued to present day. And we've also used a number of different monitoring systems. So we are very confident in the results that I will show you in the next slide. So the bottom line is that we have not seen any induced seismicity during 5 years of injection. the statistics for the minimum detectable magnitudes are provided, as well as the magnitudes of completeness. We feel that this is a very solid result, indicating there has been no induced seismicity or anything that's measurable at the site. And if you want to read more about that, you can look at Stork et al. From 2018. As well, Chris Hawks is going to talk about this in his upcoming presentation on fault slip analysis. So the last thing I'll mention is at the site, we continue to test and try and develop different kinds of methods that are suitable for monitoring CO2. We've used effectively distributed acoustic sensing technology in downhole configurations, but due to the directional response of these kinds of sensors, they're not as useful for surface layouts. So we've tried recently, this was in the January survey, we've tried a number of different fiber configurations deployed at the surface to see if we can't overcome the directional response for surface seismic monitoring. So in conclusion, here's a list of things we think we've learned or are learning at the site. And I'll give you 15 seconds to read that. And then I will pass this over to the next speaker, who I believe is Chris Hawks.
Thank you, Don. I'll leave that up there just for a second. Oh, there you go. Okay, and Chris Hawks, who's from the University of Saskatchewan, is our next speaker.
Okay. Norm, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, I sure can. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be speaking to two topics in this presentation. The first of which Don alluded to just a moment ago. If you drill an injection well into a reservoir and start injecting any fluid, CO2 or whatever it is, if there's a fault nearby, you change the pressure on that fault, there's a potential to induce slip, which in turn induces a seismic event. So we'll look at some of the investigations done surrounding that topic. And the other thing I'll talk about is getting to know the reservoir a bit, and that means running suitable logs. And that's because reservoirs, when you draw them, like I have here, they might look like nice uniform orange rectangles, but in reality, they actually have more complexity to their geometry and their makeup, and you have to get to know their internal architecture and their dynamics. So I'll speak a bit to the journey that we've followed in Aquistore to pursue that. Speaking first to the story around induced seismicity, I've put a couple of references on screen here. Most of what I'm showing comes from these, so if this topic piques your interest, there's lots of resources available that you can dig deeper into. What you have to do if you're going to analyze the potential for fault slip is you have to go looking for faults. We're looking here at an image from the 2012 3D seismic survey, a cross-sectional view. And what we can see is that there's a feature labeled here as a flexure, which actually transects the Deadwood and overlying and underlying formations. So we, rather than get into a debate whether this is a flexure or a fault, a kink or a discontinuity in terms of risk assessment, we played the conservative or pessimistic role and said, let's view this as a fault with the potential for slip. And this is a fault that is in hydraulic communication with the injection zone. So we have to have a look at how injection could affect this fault. So here we see the fault. It's near vertical in cross-sectional view. And in plan view here, we can see a trace of the fault kind of striking northwest. And it passes within about 1 kilometer of the injection well, which is shown here as the white dot. So that gives us information about the location and the orientation of a feature of interest, this fault. In order to analyze the potential for slip in that fault, we have to understand the stresses that are acting on it. So there's a bunch of geomechanical work that is done. In the lower left, we're looking at some of the borehole image logs, which allow us to see borehole breakouts, and drilling induced tensile fractures allows us to constrain horizontal stress orientations. Ben mentioned that we did a mini frac test to give us a stress magnitude at a specific depth, work from the logs and the cores to give us profiles and mechanical properties. from which we interpret profiles of stresses. And those all serve as the inputs that we can use to analyze the potential for a slip on a fault plane as a function of pressure change on that fault. If there happen to be any rock mechanics people on the line, the lower left image is for you. More circles and failure criteria. I won't speak to that here in this context. What I'll point to is the graphic on the right. Here we're looking at depth profiles of some critical stresses and pressures. And the key thing is to follow this red curve. It's showing the critical pressure that would have to be achieved on that fault in order to induce slip. And over on the far left, the blue line shows the initial pore pressure along that fault. And the gold and the dotted black lines show us the pore pressures that are believed to exist on that fault based on the outputs of reservoir simulations. So the key takeaway there is that the pore pressure increases occurring along that fault are far less than the critical values for slip. So based on this analysis, we conclude that there's a low potential for induced seismicity. Of course, you don't leave it at that. You actually monitor to assess what actually is happening as you inject. And Don has already spoken to that, and Eric showed you some of the instrumentation that's in the ground. So I won't speak to any of those details on this slide. I'll just say on the left is an image showing some of the instrumentation that was in the ground, monitoring for passive seismic events. And Don already showed a version of this graph that basically tells the story that there's different vintages and types of instrumentation in the ground that came online at different times, but some of it came online long before CO2 injection began in early 2015. And based on all this monitoring, there actually has been no injection-induced seismicity observed. So that's a favorable outcome to that part of the story. Part two of my presentation is the part about getting to know the reservoir through time-lapse logging, and I've put a couple of references on screen there for people who wish to follow up. And it begins with the characterization as you drill the original well, and Ben spoke a bit to some of these things, talked about the open hole logging programs. He used the logging results. Once you've drilled the well, the core analyses, and you make your interpretations about where are the good zones, where are the sandy zones, where should we put the perforations. And there's one perforated zone at the top here in the Black Island sandstone of the Winnipeg Formation, and then perforation zones 2, 3, and 4 in various parts of the Deadwood Formation. And so you can make assessments initially about where you think the good injectivity is going to be, but you don't really know for sure what's going where until you actually start injecting and monitoring that. So we're looking here at results of the spinner survey conducted in the injection well. And there have been a number of these run over the course of time. This one is one run in 2015, around the time that injection began, CO2 injection began. And what the spinner log is telling us is that about 10% of the injected fluid is going into perforated zone number 1, that Black Island sand of the Winnipeg Formation. And of the balance of the injected fluid, it's roughly half and a half going into perf zone number 2 and into the deepest perf zone in the Deadwood Formation. So none going into perf zone number 3. Perf zone number 2 is what we often refer to as the sweet spot, and in the data that I show in just a few moments, we'll be focusing largely on perf zone number 2. So yeah, so some complexity to the reservoir, quite a few different porous layers within it. And beyond that, there's complexity in terms of how it behaves with time. Here we're looking at the interpreted results from the 2015 spinner survey. I've thrown up the results here from a spinner survey that was run in 2019. And it shows about the same thing, about 10% of the injected fluid going into perf zone number 1 in the Black Island sand. But then virtually all the balance of the injected CO2 at this time is going into perf zone number 2 and nothing into the deeper horizons. So things are changing with time. So there's some complexity there that has to be tracked. So the spinner log tells us a bit about what's going on at the injection well. Another useful thing is to look at the observation well 150 meters away to monitor what's arriving there. And in this graph, we're looking, the blue curve is the cumulative injected CO2. Apologies, I haven't updated my graph. It doesn't come up to the present day. takes us up to 2019. The little dark squares that you see are the times at which we ran the Weatherford Pulse Neutron tool, the PND tool. And it is a tool that through casing can detect the presence of CO2. And you can see that we were running quite quickly. The first 8 runs were run in fairly rapid succession, and then we eased off a bit in terms of the time intervals. And it was on the 11th run of the PND tool that the CO2 was observed to arrive. And that corresponds pretty closely to the first monitor seismic survey that Don spoke to that showed the CO2 plume arriving at the observation well. There is a more recent run, number 18 of that tool. It was run in February of this year. And Schlumberger's RST tool, which is also a pulse neutron tool, has been run a number of times, as shown with the X's that are there. So what does it look like in a pulse neutron log? When CO2 arrives, well, the arrival of CO2 displacing the native pore fluid results in a reduction in the sigma response of the tool. So you see a number of curves here that are lying on top of each other. This is the sigma response at various points in time. And you do see separation here, the early time curves on the left, the late time curves on the right. This is telling us this interval has seen the arrival of CO2. And that information can actually be quantified to capture or to calculate CO2 saturations. That's what's showing up here in the green shaded areas, starting in run number 11, when the CO2 was first detected at the observation well. And you can see moving forward with time as we go to the right that the peak saturations and the thickness of the CO2 bearing zone is increasing. That sweet spot is right in the middle here. The logs do show us that there is a zone at the base of the Black Island Sand that is seeing CO2. And there are some intermittent thinner intervals in the lower part of the Deadwood that are seeing CO2. Some of these CO2 signals come and go from down there, and that's kind of consistent with what the spinner survey was telling us. And all this has good consistency with what Don was seeing in the seismic results, which I won't revisit here. This is the last thing I'd say before I give the floor back to the chair is the fact that by virtue of running tools from 2 different logging companies, we get to do a comparison. And here we're looking at interpreted CO2 saturations from the Schlumberger RST tool. And you can see the bright red zone here is telling us it does see the same sweet spot in perf zone number 2 and a secondary sweet spot in the Black Island Sand. You can't see it so well at this scale, but there are some blips of red in the lower part. And a final notable thing is you see no red in and above the primary seal of the cap rock. So this tool gives us a sense that there's been no upwards migration of the CO2, which is a good thing. So I will stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So our final speaker, well, not final because Eric will wrap things up. Penultimate speaker is Rick Chalaturnik from the University of Alberta. Rick.
Great, thank you. Thanks everybody. Yeah, so a bit of an honor to finish things up and share with you sort of bits and pieces, I guess, from the project, a range of things, installation experiences, some operational dynamics, well integrity, some repurposing of the fluid recovery system that Eric had spoken to, highlights of a reservoir simulation. And I think one of the more interesting things, given the conditions of our reservoir, is some salt precipitation work. One of the things we did learn a fair amount, Eric had shown this, is that you know, there were a lot of decisions made about running instrumentation. I think a lot of people are getting a lot of experience with this lately over the last 6, 7, 8 years. DTS, DAS fibers, strap to casing, all the rest of it. And so, you know, back in 2012, that was a bunch of our experiences here. It ended up being learning a great deal in sort of very complex environments. In this particular case, Ben had pointed out in the storage complex, this prairie of apatite that ended up closing in and squeezing in on the hole more than was expected, and a lot of under reaming was done in order to get this in that removed the ability to put centralizers on the casing and things like that for protection. And so learned a lot about you know, issues around running this kind of instrumentation, both tubing conveyed and casing conveyed systems. And one of the other learnings that came about from the project was a workover. At one point, there was a workover that was done to examine the tubing string and do some casing integrity logs and things like that. And you know, the conditions at 120 degrees C, reservoir temperature, highly saline fluids, corrosion rates a little higher than we expected. You know, things that happened with the tubing string, and so on. There's a fair amount of learnings, just even in things like running gauge mandrels in these kinds of environments, and what kind of conditions they had to survive under. The other thing is to share with you is that early data did provide some interesting dynamics. A lot of this instrumentation showed some very interesting things, and share some of the results with you. And the first one was just some stuff that can be seen around the cementing operations for people who, say, for instance, are focusing on well integrity and other things. And so if you look at the observation well had these 4 casing conveyed sensors. It does show the position of the FRS, but the 4 casing conveyed sensors. And so when you look at that, as you displace both the CO2 resistant cements, the lead cements, the main cement thing, you can garner some very interesting dynamic data. When you look along here, you've got these sensors that are tracking pressure and temperature as you're installing the casing. You can track that all the way to depth. And then when you land the casing and begin then the cementing operation, you know, you can track, this just shows the 3 sensors, the Black Island, the upper Deadwood, and the lower Deadwood, these locations. And you can see when the lead cements are run, the spacers, inverters. And in this particular case, there was some difficulty, blockages, prairie evaporites and other things, and you can capture these dynamics. Circulation, stage cementing is done, and you can see the hydration temperature starting to climb. Pressures eventually then will bleed off, come back to a reservoir pressure, and then even some different responses in the Black Island. And so this provides some very interesting operational dynamics that helps to look at things like well integrity. And then on the operational sides, this is essentially when CO2 began. This is the instrumentation. Oops, sorry. If down here in April 2015, and you know, many people on the webinar today will have seen data like this, but it turns out that it becomes extremely important in looking at these operational dynamics, mostly because of the balance between cooling and warming during injection and shut-ins. And so because this was quite cyclic, CO2 was going off to EOR operations, you know, you're able to capture all of these dynamics. The heat map will show you where when no injection was occurring, you had warming of the fluids, and then as soon as injection would occur, it would cool during injection periods, and then there would be multiple cycles, and you would capture all of this. And that becomes phenomenal data in terms of trying to really look at understanding how these systems respond to these cycles. The other thing that's interesting, and again, in this particular project, because of the downhole temperatures, is phase behavior of the CO2, is that over time, what happens in shut-in periods is that you can actually have a difference in temperature that'll occur up high. We have a density contrast that we actually have a lower density supercritical CO2 at depth than we do at surface. And so when the well is shut in, you get a reversal, and you actually get warming occurring at the wellhead. So these are the kinds of things that the instrumentation and sensors allowed us to interpret it over time. The other thing that was interesting here, again, you know, perhaps maybe for the individuals who are interested in the well integrity side, is that the casing conveyed sensors, which are on the outside in the cement column, showed some interesting responses. And so what you would get is that the black line that you see in this is the bottom hole injection pressure, tubing conveyed. And then the blue line, which you see responding, is actually on the outside of the casing and about 120 meters above the perf interval. And so if you focused in on a period of time, you can see there's lots of data if you wanted to focus in on it. But what's interesting is that some of this operational dynamics that occurs is that you actually see perhaps what are sort of undrained thermal responses occurring in pore pressure, and not necessarily something related to a leakage path. And so this is the kind of operational data that's been extracted from here that provides some really high fidelity, high definition results to try and look at those kinds of issues around the well. The other thing that it does is you can define things like injectivity indices, and there are other indices you can define in terms of a sort of plugging, fracturing indice. And tracking this dynamic data is really important, that as you go into cooling periods, you can get a rise in injectivity and a decrease in the fracturing index. And this happens throughout the program, and so you can track this. And so over time, what's been interesting is that injectivity has increased, the injectivity index has increased quite substantially, almost an order of magnitude with the cooling that happens during injection. You can argue multiple reasons for this, and there are things that the group is exploring, like the temperature-dependent relative permeabilities and phase behavior and so on, perhaps some reservoir geomechanical type effects. And so this has been quite an interesting finding, even under these dynamic conditions, of this thermal influence on injectivity. The other thing that was important for us is that when we looked at the MMV program and the instrumentation, is that there were some options that would have allowed us to do some repurposing. And so the early part of looking at the CO2 plume arriving at the observation well was to have this fluid recovery system. It was landed at depth, 3,230 meters deep. But this design had a particular characteristic to it that allowed us under certain conditions to be able to actually push fluids into the reservoir. So when the plume had gone a significant distance past the well, we looked at repurposing it, and we could take advantage of a fiber optic line that was casing conveyed, DTS system, that allowed us to make very detailed, accurate assessments of the density of nitrogen. And so what we've been able to do is repurpose that, and have now got now recovered a pressure system that is actually being able to track the injection pressure and respond to the injection pressure at the CO2 injection well really well. And so this is helping us now with refinements of the reservoir simulation models and history matching. And there are other things in the system as well, like the casing annulus pressure and sensor temperatures and so on. But this repurposed bubble tube has worked really well at basically extracting value-added information from something that was used early on in the project. The fair amount, because of the issues around thermal and injection pressures, you can see some of the history of the data here in terms of rates, pressures, and temperatures. There's quite a program in looking at reservoir geomechanical modeling, and not just the reservoir simulation side, under these non-isothermal conditions. Some of the stress information that Chris and others have chatted about, extracting this for 3D mechanical earth models, larger scale, near wellbore stuff to look at the issues around fracturing. And so there's a ongoing program to refine this and actually conduct these in a little bit more higher resolution models to look at the responses around the wellbores. And then just the last thing I wanted to touch on in terms of these sort of interesting learnings at an operational sense that we're getting is that there was a period in 2017 after quite an extensive period of injection. The well was shut in, the injection well was shut in. Nothing was circulated, it was injecting supercritical conditions of basically the wellhead was shut in, and it sat for about 4 months. And at the end of that 4 months, a downhole camera was run. And Chris had referred to this is a bit of the responses that you see in terms of this perfed interval number 2 that is taking CO2, and Don is showing perf 2 in this upper interval plume development. But this third perfed interval, in fact, even in spinner surveys that Chris was showing, isn't taking any CO2. But what's interesting is that so when you ran the camera, what you found was essentially this image. And hopefully nobody gets motion sickness. Ben was saying that people might get motion sickness, but this is the third perfed interval. So this is where no CO2 was injected, yet substantial amounts of precipitation occurred inside the wellbore. And so this has provided some interesting insights into the wellbore dynamics issues around what's happening with cross flow, what potentially might be happening in the pore space. You know, what does this mean relative to the kind of dynamics that might be occurring inside the reservoir? And so some really interesting ongoing learnings about this kind of information and what it means for these kinds of projects. So with that, that was the end of my presentation. And I guess it stopped sharing. That should go back to Eric.
Okay, thanks. Eric, would you like to wrap things up? We're a little bit behind, but that's all right. We will still take questions at the end for those of you who can hold on. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay, thank you, Norm. Just a couple minutes to wrap up at the end. Am I on the right screen here? Possibly not. I hope everyone can see my screen. Where are we now? We are, and we consider ourselves to be one of the premier publicly funded and owned CCS projects in Canada, and probably among the top in the world. It's a project that you can be a part of. We have ongoing real and impactful reductions in industrial emissions, such as the fact that we've stored 300,000 tons, which our communications people have termed as 75,000 cars off the road for 1 year. So it starts to become sort of interesting what the potential is here. We've also had a lot of direct economic impact on the local economy and on the larger economy and research organizations with jobs and creations of highly qualified people. We have real operational results. And the next CCS breakthroughs, as some we've seen here, will only happen if we support the existing projects. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, you know, this is just something for coal plants. This just allows us to keep our dependency on fossil fuels, and to a degree that is true. However, if we start talking about waste streams from cement and steel plants, also refineries, but even the novel green initiatives such as direct air capture, as shown in the picture on the right here, and blue hydrogen production, things like biomass and ethanol manufacture, they all need storage of CO2 that these things capture. So, you know, we want to use this to even backstop potential CO2 usage options. I know that there's a lot of work going on in CO2 usage, but you know, when those processes aren't running efficiently, we need to step in and store this safely. And one thing we do know that all storage needs to be measured, monitored, and verified to provide the regulatory and public assurance in an area that's geologically suitable. And that's what we know how to do here. So regardless of whether it's from direct air capture or coal, makes no difference to the injection part of it. Sort of the new lines of research or ongoing things that we're doing are obviously the fiber optic seismic, ultimate capacity reservoir estimation, and you know, we're beginning discussions of a third well. We are also discussing geothermal with a group out of Europe. That CO2 as a geothermal carrier might be an interesting thing. And obviously Rick talked about the novel pressure monitoring systems and big data analytics of all of the data streams. So that just means taking all of the data that we have and looking at it in novel ways. And perhaps I can take this opportunity to answer one of the questions around monitoring. I believe it was Phil Ringrose had that. And that is to say that, yes, while when this project was conceived, it was supposed to be the Cadillac of monitoring operations. But now that we're a number of years into it and looking to turn it over in the next 3 years to just regular industrial operations, that we are looking at paring back the, evaluating and paring back the monitoring systems to find out what is the minimum, because not all projects can be as spendy as we've been on Aquistore. So to operate and grow the knowledge at the Aquistore site, we need continued funding. We maintain some private consortium funding, but more is required to do these growth operations that we have in mind. Aquistore is one of the few operational sites that you have the ability to take control of. You know, you can speak to existing members, but you know, the ability is there to become a member of Aquistore and sit on the CERC committee and have some of your own research or items tested out at the site. So this can all look different for different organizations, and the PTRC is very open to discussing this with you. You'll be contacted in the next few days with some options to have some private meetings with us. Of course, I'd be remiss without thanking our funders. especially the Government of Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and the group headed by Eddie Chu there for coming through at a time when we made the very important decision to go forward with the wells and the project in general. We have ongoing corporate sponsorship from Mosaic, ANLEC, and JOGMEC, and we thank the members online from those organizations as well. John Unro, Kevin Dodds, and Shimoda Noyuki from JOGMEC. Obviously, we have university researchers and other strategic partners that we're working with. But if you would wish to get a hold of us, you will hear from us soon, but those are our contact information. Thank you very much, and we'll take some questions now. Hopefully there's a few minutes.
Yep, thank you, Eric. So I believe Zainab is going to read off some of the questions. We did have a few questions that came in over the chat because not everyone had the paid version of Zoom or whatever that version is that allows you to see the Q&A. So I will deal with those one or two questions from the chat, but Zainab, if you'd like to ask some of the ones from the Q&A.
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everyone. Welcome to question and answer session on the webinar. We had quite a few questions coming in. We have about 100 people who are here at the webinar right now. I'm going to start with a question for Dr. Ben Rostron. This question is from Sarah Salzer. Is there a basal seal? Any concern with induced seismicity as the reservoir pressure increases due to CO2 injection? The reservoir appears to be close to the Precambrian basement, which appears to have a number of faults. Ben, if you could give us some comments on that.
Sure. Well, there's 5 parts to one question, but so is there a basal seal? No. Essentially, the reservoir sits right on top of the Precambrian surface. That top part of the Precambrian surface is actually quite weathered and fractured. And so that definitely is going to conduct some fluids. When you get below that, a few meters, and we drilled into the Precambrian and tried to do some characterization of that surface, basically. When you get below that, you get typical sort of Precambrian, granitic, gneissic, plutonic, whatever rocks. So we don't expect a lot of fluid transmission once you get into the unweathered zone of that thing. Is there a concern with microseismicity? Yeah, yes, for sure. And I think, Don mentioned that we've done a lot of monitoring on that. So we haven't seen any microseismicity, and we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, why haven't we seen microseismicity, and are we worried about that? I think for our site, a combination of laterally extensive injection horizon and relatively low injection rates. We're at 300,000 tons approximately today. And, we've been injecting for multiple 5 years, 6 years. So not a lot of high rate injection. We have tested high rate injection while we've been listening and haven't seen anything. But no, the short answer is we haven't seen any of that. And we don't think we're pressuring up the Precambrian. So.
Okay, thank you, Ben, for that answer. Another question from one of our attendees from Shell. This question is for Dr. Rick Chalaternik. Rick, the question is, do you have any experience with DAS DTS used for CO2 injection allocation and leakage detection? And if it's necessary? Rick, if you could give us some comments on that, please.
I think at one point we attempted to use the DTS line that was on the tubing. That was the precursor to the workover program to look at the responses of the DTS. What happens in the operational phases of this kind of project is that if you collect meter by meter by meter resolution on the DTS over the length of 3,000 meters, and you do that every minute for multiple years of the project, yeah, that becomes tricky. So in fact, what happened was, as an operational phase, DTS was actually monitored every 100 meters, and that was actually what was stored in the distributed control system for SaskPower. So the resolution didn't quite work out, but there was I think there was enough evidence that if a certain period of time, if you monitored it close enough, that in fact you could pick up differential temperature across leakage at the joints of the tubing. But we weren't entirely successful at doing that. But in the injection well, DTS or DAS, I think less certain under these operational kind of dynamics, but we didn't really apply that in a big way to the CO2 injection well.
Okay, thank you so much, Rick. Our next question is from one of our attendees from Equinor to Dr. Don White. With respect to active seismic monitoring, what is the minimum detection thickness of the time-lapse observations? Could you please elaborate a bit on the dip and plume extent? How large is the dip, and does the plume speed confirm with your upfront predictions? If not, have you updated your reservoir simulations based on that? Dr. Don White, if you could give us some comment on that, please.
Sure, that was a long question. So if I missed part of it, remind me. In terms of the dips, regionally, the dip on the strata within the reservoir, it's on the order of a degree or a degree and a half. So it's pretty flat lying. Detection thickness, seismically is always dependent on signal to noise levels, but we have demonstrated here that we are detecting a layer of CO2 that is less than 10 meters. It's somewhere between, it's 10 meters or less at 3,400 meters depth. The extent of the plume, if you look at the main body of it in the last survey, for the most part, it is within 250 meters from the injection well. Of course, on the southwest side, its spread is being limited by something. Personally, I think it's a barrier if you look at the topography on the Precambrian basement and also that lineation that Chris Hawk showed. Phil Ringrose was asking that question, I think, as opposed to a high permeability fairway. In regard to the speed of the CO2 spread, I didn't have any preconceived ideas, so I will leave that for the other members like Ben Rostron.
Awesome, thank you so much, Don. Our next question, it's an open question. I ask any of our panel members to, if they wish, they can answer this question. This question is from Susan from University of Texas. The plume has passed the observation well now. For future projects, would you keep a monitoring well close in for early time information or farther out for longer time information? Any of our panel members who would like to answer that question, please go ahead.
I don't think anybody wants to answer that question because we don't have enough time to argue about that in front of 90 people. But so I guess we've grappled with, that's a good question, and thanks for the question. And it's a really important question because you have this question about do you gather early time data to calibrate your models, or do you put the observation well farther away and have a wider area investigation? So I can't speak for the other members of the panel, but I would say that I would still put the well in fairly close, but maybe not as close as we put it before, because we have higher confidence in our reservoir simulations now than we did when we started. There were no really good detailed characterizations of the reservoir at the time, and we weren't sure about reservoir continuity. We have new information now. For instance, there's the Deep Energy company has drilled a couple wells 10 kilometers so away from us, and we can correlate our reservoir with their reservoir, which means that we have much higher confidence in the geology than we did before. But yeah, so I think maybe not 150 meters away, but maybe I still wouldn't put it 3 or 4 kilometers away. But that's my view. So I turn it over to the others.
Well, I tend to agree. I think the decision on the distance of that observation well depends on the strength of your reservoir characterization. If you have to actually defend your dynamic model early on in the project because you have a high uncertainty in the geological model, then yeah, your monitoring well should be in closer. And in fact, 150 meters away for this was probably not so bad given what Ben talked about, the distance of the characterization data that we had at the beginning. But ultimately, there might be, depending on what you're trying to answer, you might find that there's a reason for having two distances of observation wells. I mean, I know it's extra money, but there's a certain question that you would answer with the wells being in closer, updating the geological information and updating the dynamic model, confirming that it's doing what you think it's going to do. And then farther reaching observation wells that help you answer larger questions such as capacity and other things like that. So yeah, I probably would tend with Ben. 150 was you know, who knows, maybe it was a little tighter than we would have liked in hindsight, but still not a bad decision, all things being equal.
Thank you so much, Ben and Rick, for taking the questions. Of course, Rick, there's a question on the total capacity and estimated total capacity for sure, and potential for importing more CO2. Have we done, has Aquistore, PTRC members have done anything to estimate the total capacity of the site?
So there have been estimates, but in the literature, many people on the line, I think, will you know, you go and find a capacity site and you hear numbers like 5 megatons and 10 megatons and so on. But from an operational case, yes, enough has been done to expand the capacity estimates in the short term for what SaskPower needs for their operational facilities. You know, but that, you know, that's getting to be in the order of, you know, 3/4 of a million tons or a megaton. But that's the whole point of expanding the simulation work, expanding, Ben had mentioned, looking elsewhere, like the deep wells and other stuff, to expand our knowledge farther on, doing much larger scale simulation work. So it's, and as Eric had mentioned, I think he mentioned about the third well and some other things that are being thought about. Those are meant to try and look out farther, farther reaching in terms of trying to define capacity.
Yeah, and I'll just add that you know, the part of the question is, you know, we have improved knowledge over the reservoir itself. So for those people that are on the webinar that aren't aware of the geology here, we have pretty well layer cake geology going for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. So you know, when you do a prediction of injectivity or ultimate storage capacity, it's a difficult thing to do because you have to put bounds on the question. How long do you have? How much area do you want to impact? How big is your monitoring going to be, et cetera? So, you know, you can play what if games and build a numerical simulation that goes 400 kilometers in every direction and show that it will take CO2. But when you get to the practical level of trying to do a public engagement or licensing or designing a monitoring program, that puts much smaller bounds on the problem. So it's a difficult question to say what's the ultimate value, but I think you have to talk in terms of how much could you do in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, et cetera.
Thank you so much, Ben and Rick.
I just thought I'd interject here. We're going to finish up at 10:20, so we have about 5 more minutes. I thought I would ask one question that was directed to Chris, and then I'll let Zainab get back to the one here. And it was about the fault, and how does the fault affect the upward CO2 flow at the vicinity of the injection well? And that's from Saeed Mustafa Jafari Rad.
Sure, and that's a good question. And the CO2 actually hasn't reached that fault, if it actually is a fault. I'm more in the flexure camp myself. Really, it's a question of maintaining the monitoring and seeing what happens when the plume actually reaches that fault or that flexure. There's been no indication thus far that the fault is a permeable conduit in terms of any data that's been generated so far. And obviously no means of directly measuring the permeability of that fault or flexure.
Okay.
So I don't think yeah. Okay, thank you.
Maybe Zainab, one more question, and then again, I'll let everybody know that all the questions that we have down here, we have 25. We are going to download these and we will provide some written answers for them as well. But maybe one more question, Zainab.
Okay, for sure. So we have a question from one of our attendees from Equinor. When you say geological structure controls the lateral plume extension, do you suspect the effect of barriers, or are high permeability highways more likely? I'd like to ask Dr. Rick Chalaturnik if you could answer this question. Or
Say that again.
When you say geological structure controls the lateral plume extension, do you suspect the effect of barriers, or are high permeability highways more likely?
Okay. So, you know, I think this gets back to the question that Chris and Don were chatting about in terms of the flexure and other things, is that there's some ongoing work, not really finalized, but is trying to think about how the flexure structure on the Precambrian goes up into the Deadwood, and whether that particular process would create, if you like, permeability barriers or some kind of limited flow barriers that is actually providing the plume some restrictions in moving to the southwest, or have we just not got, you know, has the plume just not got big enough? I mean, one of the other things that I think all the members in the CERC committee are quite sensitive to is that the plume is at 300,000 tons. This is not, you know, at 5 megatons yet, and so at 300,000 tons, it can be really sensitive to probably some nuances inside the reservoir. So I think there's ongoing work to try and figure out, you know, what do we have in the geoscience side of things that helps us answer that question.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rick. Thanks to all the panelists to take the time and answer these questions. We have some more questions that we can't get to today. We'll capture further on some questions and be pointing people to publications from our panel members, and also we'll provide some more information regarding those questions. Back to you, Norm.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for participating. This has been very good. I've actually learned some things, and I've been involved with this project since it started back about 7 or 8 years ago. So thank you to our panelists. Thanks to Eric for doing a lot of the planning and arranging for this as well. If you have additional questions, you should have my email address. We will be following up with emails to all participants, and those of you who still left us with questions, I will be turning those over to our 5 panelists so that they can respond accordingly. And again, thank you. Everybody stay safe. I know we have strange times right now, so I hope that everybody is able to work safely and continue with their fields of study.